I would like to thank everybody who came to listen to a presentation. It's a great honor to have the opportunity to host Professor Larry Dаймонд at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Professor Larry Dаймонд is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where he directs the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. This community, the most recent accomplishment of the Center of Democracy, as some people argue, came in the spring of 2011 by building a technological community between Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt, and Silicon Valley. This community has fully focused on helping mobilize protesters in Egypt who eventually helped to downfall the oppressive regime. Professor Dаймонд also serves as a faculty co-director of the Haas Center for Public Service at Stanford. He is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and also serves as senior consultant and previously was co-director at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment of Democracy. During 2022-23, he served as a consultant to the United States Agency for International Development and was a contributing author of its report, Foreign Aid in the National Interest. He has also advised and lectured to the World Bank, the United Nations, the State Department, and other governmental and non-governmental agencies dealing with governance and development in many countries. At Stanford University, Professor Dаймонд is also professor of political science and sociology. He teaches courses on comparative democratic development and post-conflict democracy building and advises many Stanford students. In May 2007, he was named Teacher of the Year by the Associated Students in Stanford University. He was cited for his inspired teaching and commitment to undergraduate education, for the example he sets as a scholar and public intellectual, sharing his passion for democratization, peaceful transition, and the idea that each of us can contribute to making the world a better place, and for helping make Stanford University an ideal place for undergraduates. The graduating class at Stanford University was selected Larry Dаймонд as the last year in 2012 as the Class Day Speaker. A 4-decade-long tradition at Stanford University, the Class Day lecture is delivered by a well-liked Stanford faculty member who addresses the graduating class together with their friends and family. During the 3 months of 2004, Larry Dаймонд served as a senior advisor on governance to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad. Since then, he has lectured and written extensively on the United States policy in Iraq and the wider challenges of post-conflict stabilization and recognition, and was one of the advisors to the Iraq study group. His book, published in 2005, The American Occupation and the Bundled Effort to Bring Democracy to Iraq, was one of the first books to critically analyze America's post-war engagement in Iraq. He has also participated in several working groups on the Middle East. During 2004-2005, he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force on the United States policy towards Arab reforms. Professor Dаймонд's latest book, The Spirit of Democracy, The Struggle to Build Free Society Throughout the World, published in 2008, explores the sources of global democratic progress and stress the prospects for future democratic expansion. Professor Dаймонд has edited or co-edited some 36 books on democracy, including the recent titles How People View Democracy, How East Asians View Democracy, and many others. I would like also to mention his highly influential series, Democracy in Development Countries, he co-edited with Juan Linz and Seymour Martin Lipscomb. The topic of Professor Dаймонд's presentation today is electoral democracy, liberal democracy, and the global recession of democracy. This is a very important and timely topic for this country of ours. Unfortunately, Ukraine, which was a part of a powerful third wave of democratization that swept the whole world, currently moves in the opposite direction. Perhaps never in its history, Ukraine has corresponded to the criteria of a liberal democracy. At the same time, at least Ukraine has been an electoral democracy. Are we still an electoral democracy? If not, then what? Sultanic kleptocracy? Or perhaps kleptocratic sultanism? The presentation will last for about 50 to 60 minutes. Then we open the floor, and I would welcome everybody to ask questions. There is a microphone right in the middle of the auditorium. I would like to ask everybody to switch off your cell phones. Professor Diamond, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andre. I am very honored to be invited here to speak to so many of you at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which I understand is not only the oldest, but the most distinguished university in Ukraine. And this is my third visit to Kyiv. This city has kind of a special place in my heart, obviously, because of the epical events that happened here that have been labeled the Orange Revolution, and to walk in the square where this happened, and to be in the society that inspired the world with these events is very moving and a very great honor. I want to just make a couple of preliminary remarks. First of all, thanks to your Dean of the Law School, Professor Melashevich, for introducing me and welcoming me, and I had the pleasure of meeting your distinguished president, Professor Kvit, before we came here, and I'm very honored and grateful for their welcome. I do want to say I am aware of the fact that many people in Ukraine and many people outside of your country are worried about the state of democracy here, and even debate whether Ukraine can still, at the moment, be labeled a democracy. I'll address that if you ask me to. I will not explicitly address it in my lecture itself. But I do want to just emphasize that democratization is not a linear process. You don't move from, or it's relatively unusual for a country to move in a straight line from authoritarianism to electoral democracy, from electoral democracy to liberal democracy, and then consolidated democracy without some form of backward movement, regression, struggle, difficulties of various kinds. And I just hope that as you, your society, your country, your political system confront difficulties, and you obviously are now, that you will not be discouraged, and that you will keep your eyes focused on the long struggle. So let me begin by talking about electoral democracy. I think you all understand what I'm talking about here. Then I want to articulate a concept of liberal democracy and expand on it by identifying 12 different dimensions of the quality of democracy that constitute the essence of a high quality or liberal democracy. And I use those two terms interchangeably. I'm going to go through this very quickly. The slides will be I'm quite happy that the slides will be made fully available to anybody who wants them. And I've covered a lot of this in some of my writing that is perhaps familiar to some of you. Then I want to talk about the trends in democracy, and particularly the recent trends, and why I think we are and have been for some years now in a global recession of democracy, and why I think that has been happening. So let's begin with the next slide. What is electoral democracy? It's a very minimal conception but yet it has a robust set of conditions, and it just means that there is a political system at the level of the nation state in which people can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in regular, meaningful, free and fair elections. And this may sound like a very minimal set of conditions, but as I explain in my book, The Spirit of Democracy, and don't have the time to fully articulate here, to have free and fair elections means much more than to have a situation in which voting is not massively rigged on election day. There has to be neutral administration of the electoral process. There has to be a relatively level playing field. There has to be a relatively open arena for political competition, for candidates and parties to enter and compete. Elections have to matter in terms of having consequences for who rules. It's ridiculous to call Iran a democracy, not only because the electoral field was so constrained, not only in this past election in June, but in previous ones as well, but also the ultimate power in Iran it does not lie with the semi-elected president. It lies with the supreme leader who's there for life and really in the end answerable to no one, at least no human being. And so we can't call that a democracy in any allusion to a country like that or Venezuela or many others in which there are elections in which people come out to vote. To those systems being at least an electoral democracy really, I think, distorts the meaning of the term. So there has to be sufficient freedom to participate, to demonstrate, to campaign, to move around the country, and to enter and exit the political arena in order for there to be even an electoral democracy. So these are not trivial conditions. Now, we can think of a liberal democracy in the next slide as basically resting on three conceptual pillars. And you see here that I have now taken the different dimensions of the quality of democracy and in a crude way group them into three categories. And then I'll go through them in a somewhat different sequence in the slides that follow. So first of all, we have democracy in the kind of elementary sense that it's often understood, and I'd say sometimes simplistically understood as simply majority rule, popular sovereignty. People vote, and whoever has the most support in the country then gets the right to rule and make decisions. And this means that, of course, there's political competition, there's political participation, there's vertical accountability in the sense that people can hold their government accountable and change their government in elections, but even that is not the only dimension of vertical accountability, as I will explain. And through elections, but also through other means, the people can make the government respond to their wishes. So that's the kind of popular sovereignty dimension. But there's also a dimension of literally liberal government, and that means freedom. That means protection for not only majority rule, but minority rights. And if there aren't significant protections for and respect for and inclusion of minorities of all kinds, identity minorities, political minorities, and so on, then democracy is diminished. It's not of high quality. And there's also the dimension, as I will explain a little bit later, of equality and the difficult, now in the world we live in, troubling relationship between political equality and socioeconomic equality. And then the concept of political culture, of the way that people think and participate in politics, the civic culture. Finally, there's the dimension that most challenges the quest for a quality and sustainable democracy of the Republican form of government, going back to the earliest concept of it in Plato's Republic, of good government, a government that governs with the well-being of the population in mind that has a responsible state, a rule of law state, a state in which there are checks and balances, and an elaborated concept of that, which I will explain, called horizontal accountability, and an effective state, a state that has the capacity to accomplish things for the larger society. So, in a nutshell, if you have to explain it as quickly as I just did on a single slide, that is the framework I'm presenting to you of a liberal democracy, which means not neoliberal in the economic sense, but liberal in the free sense of a high-quality democracy. Next slide. So let me begin very quickly now, and I apologize for going quickly, but I want to get to the substantive and empirical story here of the components of high-quality democracy. Let me go through them now in a little bit more detail. For me, this begins with liberty, with extensive individual and group freedom to speak, to assemble, to express their views in print and on the broadcast media. And now, inescapably, this means, I can underscore this emphatically enough, and since most of you are in a generation that grew up with this, you will identify with this point, freedom on the net, freedom online, and open and wide access to digital media. It means as well freedom of physical space, of assembly, of movement, and obviously freedom of people to believe, to worship, to use whatever language they want in their own settings and cultural groupings. Turkey can't possibly be a high-quality democracy until there's full freedom, which there's been some progress toward, but there's also still a great deal of contestation around. Full freedom of the Kurdish minority to use its own language in schooling and so on. And then, next slide, there are also protections, or in a way, negative freedoms. Freedom from torture, freedom from warrantless search and seizure. And we know from recent revelations that in the digital era, this is a very serious problem, even in the oldest and one of the more liberal democracies in the world, in the United States, where our own national security agency has been widely intercepting electronic communications in a way that generates questions about whether the principle that people should be free from seizure of their personal property and information without a judicial warrant, whether this is being respected. Freedom from corruption is a very important part of a quality democracy, and I'm going to come back to this. Now this leads into the next slide, which has to do with the rule of law. And this should not be construed narrowly. If it's construed narrowly, it really is what you have in Singapore, which is rule by law. It's not the rule of law. Singapore, if you look at some ratings of the rule of law, may score very highly, because if companies have a contractual dispute that they need to resolve, they can go into the courts and relatively speedily, efficiently, with a knowledgeable and well-trained judiciary, get an impressively well administered resolution of their contractual dispute. Well, very nice. But what happens to a university professor who is critical of the ruling party, the People's Action Party, and speaks out very openly against it, both on campus and off, is told by his department chair that he'd better rein in his criticisms or he's going to have difficulties, and then is fired from a tenured professorship on totally ridiculous and trumped-up charges because he was critical of the ruling party. And then when he continues to criticize the dominant figure in Singapore for several decades now, the former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. He's sued into bankruptcy by the former Prime Minister, and I visited his personal home. I can tell you it was a shocking, a jarring experience for him and his family. And the courts just roll over and award hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages to this already very rich Prime Minister. And if you want to look it up, I'm talking about a former psychology professor who I talk about in my book, The Spirit of Democracy, Chi Soon-Juan. That's not the rule of law. So if you have a rule of law, no one is above the law is impartial, it doesn't serve the ruling party, it doesn't serve the current or former head of government, it doesn't serve anybody but a neutral and fair interpretation of the laws of the country. All citizens are equal under the law, no one can be arbitrarily arrested. I don't know, with the dean of the law school sitting here, I'm not sure I need to even go into all of this, or maybe I should yield the podium to him. There's also a strong sense of limits on government power. And it doesn't matter who the government official is, they're not above the law and the Constitution. And if this is going to be protected, it is a sacred principle of the rule of law, and one of the more challenging goals to achieve in reality rather than just in concept, that the courts have to be independent. And much of the struggle, not only for the rule of law in this sense, but for horizontal accountability in the other senses that I'm going to come back to it in a moment, has to do with how, in practice, countries achieve these principles. It's a very, very thorny and challenging reality. Next slide. Other basic principles of the rule of law include, but are not limited to, the obvious requirement that people should have the right to know the charges against them and to be presumed innocent until they're proven guilty in a public trial by an impartial court. They have a right to a fair and speedy trial. And of course, there's no retrospective lawmaking that people can be subjected to. They can't be taxed or prosecuted except by laws that are known and established in advance of their behavior. And again, no one, I believe anyway, under a true rule of law should ever be subjected to torture or cruel and inhumane treatment. The third principle, next slide, is then following from this and enlarging on the concept of the rule of law, horizontal accountability. And this means that there are multiple different agencies and centers of power in government, and they are balancing and checking one another. Power is separated and dispersed among these different centers of power and authority and responsibility in government. So what is the result of that? First of all, executive power is limited and constrained, not only by the judiciary, but by a legislature that is autonomous and efficacious. And I'll say here, not as a conceptual point now or a theoretical point, but as an empirical point that's been demonstrated with a considerable amount of innovative recent statistical evidence, that there is a very interesting and striking relationship between the strength of a national legislature, the powers that it has, and its actual demonstrated ability to use them autonomously from the executive branch, a relationship between that and the overall quality and stability of democracy, which could be measured, for example, as I will do in a little while, with the annual ratings of political rights and civil liberties from Freedom House. If you independently measure the extent of legislative powers to initiate legislation rather than have it be received from the executive branch and then, kind of adopted by acclamation, the ability to pass a budget or reject it, the ability to hold hearings and hold the government accountable in a variety of ways, the strength of the committee system of Parliament and so on, and you then construct, as Professor Steve Fish at UC Berkeley and his colleague have done, a legislative powers index. There's a very strong correlation between that index of legislative power and the overall quality of democracy, and a strong relationship between legislative power and the stability and survival of democracy. And there's much more to having strong horizontal accountability than just the traditional separation of powers that reside in the classic writings of authors like Montesquieu. We have now not just executive, legislature, and judiciary, but in democratic theory, in democratic practice, in the evolution and working of constitutional design, there has emerged, willy-nilly, I would argue, a concept of a fourth branch of government. Legislature, executive, judiciary, and then a constellation of institutions of regulation and oversight that have a similar nature in terms of being additional mechanisms to ensure and enforce the accountability of these other actors, particularly the executive branch, but also the legislature and each of these agencies holding one another accountable. So what are they? Well, most new democracies have these agencies, at least in theory, and the challenge is how you get them in practice. And sorry, I didn't ask you to go to the next slide. So here they are. First of all, a counter-corruption commission that can monitor the behavior of government officials and ensure that they are not misusing their office for private gain. And here it is very important. I think it is an extremely valuable, if not essential, tool of effective control of corruption by public officials, that all public officials, all members of parliament, all elected officials at the national and provincial levels, say, and high appointed officials as well, should have to declare their assets on taking office, every year thereafter, and then on leaving office. And personally, I think it's important that these assets declarations be made more or less publicly available. Because if people declare their assets when they enter government, and then they're just put in a drawer somewhere, how can it be reliably determined whether they have declared them honestly or not, or whether they have property that the Counter-Corruption Commission may not know about, but you, who are perhaps living next door to one of their mansions, may know about? So that's one, a Counter-Corruption Commission that's monitoring the behavior of public officials and their personal finances. Second, an ombudsman or some public complaints commission where citizens can go if they feel they've been treated unfairly or abusively by a policeman, by a tax authority, by an immigration official, whatever it might be. Third, I've already referred to investigative committees of parliament that can look into questionable activity, possibly illegal activity by some executive branch agency, or wrongdoing of any kind. And then fourth is the function of auditing. That is, having some kind of supreme audit agency. In the United States, it's called the Government Accountability Office, that can look at the finances of different government ministries and bureaus and assess their functioning and ensure that they're behaving ethically and according to the law. Obviously, the prosecutors and the courts are another dimension of this. The National Electoral Commission ensures that there's fair, accountable behavior in terms of the administration of elections. We could include the central bank here. Now, I'll just say about this, and I'm sorry I don't have the time to develop it further, to emphasize again, most countries, particularly democracies, have these agencies in theory, on paper. But if these agencies are not independent of the executive branch, if they do not have leadership that is committed to the purpose of the agency, rather than to protecting the president or the ruling party, then obviously they're not going to be effective. They're just going to be window dressing. They're just going to be a public facade. And so the whole game here is in thinking about how these agencies and their memberships, their leaders and their members, can be appointed, funded, supervised, and protected, insulated from executive interference so that they can actually perform their mission. And we can talk about that later if you wish. Next slide. So fourth is civilian control of the military, the police, and the intelligence apparatus. And you're lucky in Ukraine and in much of the post-communist world that this part of the world did not have a history of overt military rule. This is not like some parts of Asia and Latin America where dictatorship took the form of military rule. But in some parts of the world, Burma is struggling with this now, and Egypt is still struggling with this now. There is a decades-long history, not only of military rule, but of deep and often very subtle military penetration into so many dimensions of economic, political, and social life, with the military owning a large number of industries and having its own financing, weapons acquisitions, and organization like a black box that nobody in Parliament has really any idea of what happens inside of. And so it's very important in those countries that the military begin to be subjected to civilian scrutiny and civilian control, both by elected officials and their appointees, and also by legislative committees that develop some expertise in this area. The commander-in-chief of the military should not be the top general. Rather, it should be the head of government. And that head of government should have ultimate control over at least the top military officer appointments. Next slide. The budgets of the armed forces, but also of the intelligence and state security agencies, should also be approved by civilian executive and legislative authorities. And a very important part of having a deep and high quality level of civilian control of the security apparatus means the development of, and it's a slow and incremental process, expertise among civilians in the structure of the military and the intelligence apparatus so that they can be effective regulators of these operations. And let me say that in a number of countries that have gone from authoritarian to democratic rule, the problem may not be a legacy of military rule or military autonomy, but it may still be a legacy of the intelligence apparatus being involved in domestic politics and being used and misused by the government of the day for political ends. It is a very sacred principle of a quality democracy that the intelligence apparatus should be focused on the external national security of the country, and if there's obviously a concern about terrorist penetration, that limited function as well, but should never be a tool or a political weapon in the domestic electoral politics of the country. And I know that even in some countries that are seen to have become liberal democracies, including a couple I can think of in East Asia, this has been a problem in the past. And so having an intelligence community that's carefully regulated on a bipartisan or multi-partisan basis and powerfully insulated from partisan politics is a very important principle of democratic quality. Next slide essentially says what I've just said, that the armed forces and the intelligence apparatus need to be non-partisan and non-political, and this also applies to the police as well. And by the way, if some of you are going to become political scientists and are looking to make your mark on the literature and comparative politics, one thing I can say is that we have a very rich literature on civil-military relations and how you develop civilian control of the military. We do not have a very rich literature on the relationships between democratic civilian authority and policing. Keep in mind, what is the most common way that a democratic citizen may interact with the state? It's often an encounter with a police officer. And so if you don't think about the quality of policing, the professionalism of policing, the fidelity to democratic principles of the police, and their honesty, transparency, and resistance to corruption, you're missing a big part of the state that ordinary citizens experience on a daily basis. So a lot of thought needs to be given to that as well. Next slide. Obviously, a quality democracy is a very competitive democracy. There need to be, at a minimum, 2 political parties with significant representation in parliament and a meaningful chance to win control of the national government. But beyond that, there need to be low barriers to entry on the part of new political parties. Now, I'm just going to stop here and make a very brief digression about the United States. If you look at the different ratings of democracy in the world, it's a little bit hard to do with the data I'm going to show from the Freedom House survey of political rights and civil liberties, because those 2 scales each range from 7 being least free to 1 being most free. And if you don't look at the more detailed scores of Freedom House, you don't see variation among, say, the liberal democracies of the world, all of which are in Europe and the United States generally, a 1 on political rights and a 1 on civil liberties, the 2 best scores. But if you look at other scorings of the quality of democracy in the world, and one is the Economist Intelligence Unit's annual democracy index, I have some problems with that methodologically. We could talk about that some other time. But I think it's a useful and more sensitive indicator. And you see what I think is a fair empirical judgment, which is, I'm going to be honest with you, the United States is not the best, highest quality, most liberal democracy. It's not number 1, it's not number 5, it's not even number 10. It's considerably behind. And there are a number of reasons for that. I've already referred to one of them in terms of the control of private information and what's been happening in terms of digital records. But there's some more basic ones. And one of them has to do with the fact that in one respect, the United States is actually not a very competitive democracy. It is, of course, between the 2 dominant political parties, the Democratic and Republican Party. But it's healthy to ask the question now and then, why aren't there more political parties in the United States? And of course, those of you who are political science students know that a very big reason is because we have a presidential system and a simple first-past-the-post electoral system. But there are also very significant and subtle barriers to entry to prevent other political parties or nonpartisan alternatives from emerging, and increasing problems of political polarization resulting from that, because it's very hard for any alternative that might try and bridge the gap between Democrats and Republicans to gain a footing in the United States. And it's still the case, although we've overcome this in the state of California where I live, that in many states in the United States, every 10 years, the electoral district boundaries are drawn not by a neutral and independent electoral commission, but rather by the state legislatures and then approved by the state governors. Well, if you have a situation where both houses of a state legislature and the state governor are all of one political party, and they can draw the electoral district boundaries in a first-past-the-post system literally any way they want, then they can draw them, and do draw them, in very tortuous and, in a substantive sense, illogical fashion when you look at the map, to try and maximize the representation for their party. That's a distortion of the quality of democracy. And it's only one example among many where, I'll just be honest in saying, in the United States we have a lot of work to do to improve the quality of democracy. Next slide. So competitiveness means also that there's a relatively level playing field, that there's at least limited use of government resources by the ruling party to try and re-elect itself. Certainly there should be, as I said, fair elections in terms of the absence of fraud or vote buying. And there needs to be, obviously, another principle of fairness, at least reasonably balanced access by different political parties to campaign finance and to TV, radio, and other media. And this is a problem not only in the United States, but in many democracies, old and new, because television in particular is so expensive. Next slide. A liberal democracy is a democracy in which there's a rich civil society, a pluralistic civil society, in which there are a lot of non-governmental organizations, different interest groups, able to represent the interests and values of their constituencies. Think tanks, I think this is an extremely important function in a quality democracy that can study, monitor, evaluate the political process, expose abuses, become advocates for political reform. And there are many different sources of information. And now, of course, in the digital era we live in, this can be very empowering because the costs of starting up new media have declined dramatically. You don't need a printing press anymore. You just need a good webmaster and the access to a website and maybe some enterprising, budding online journalists to have an impact. And indeed, in Malaysia, a lot of the progress that Malaysia has made, it's not quite there yet, but it's made a lot of progress from one-party dominant rule inching toward electoral democracy, is a result of the growth of digital media, particularly an online publication called Malaysia Kini, which has broken the monopoly of the ruling coalition over the media and created a much more pluralistic media environment, and that goes along with more pluralistic civil society as well. The next slide has to do with vertical accountability, and of course the ability of people to hold their officials accountable in elections is only one part of that. The second part, next slide, has to do, again, following on what I just said, with societal accountability. It's not enough for people to just hold their government accountable once every, say, 4 or 5 years in national elections. What happens afterwards in terms of the potential for government abuse of its authority? This is where civil society and the mass media become very important in between elections to, if necessary, expose government wrongdoing, expose efforts to accumulate and monopolize power, mobilize people to be vigilant and devoted to democratic principles, and to confront the potential abuse of power. Next slide has to do with participation. A quality democracy is one in which citizens from a very early age become active in politics, and develop a stake in public policy. Part of this is ensuring and stimulating high rates of voter turnout, but there are other dimensions of this in terms of, and this is the ideal. I don't say it's attained in many democracies in the world, but trying to widen public interest in major issues and stimulate public debate over them, stimulate citizens to themselves monitor the conduct of government, of executive and legislative officials, and to have, as Tocqueville observed in the United States in the early 19th century, a society of people who are constantly taking the initiative to form organizations, to join organizations, to combine their various talents and initiatives, to create a better society, and to advocate for their interests and principles. Next slide. To have a quality democracy means to have some degree of equality. Because if democracy is to be of quality, citizens have to have at least some basis of similarity in their ability to affect public policy. Now we know it's never truly similar. And in every democracy, and it's a huge problem in the United States, but increasingly in Europe as well, money distorts the process. Money allows greater voice, money allows greater electoral influence. But that inequality can be leveled, in theory anyway, with restraints on the extent to which citizens can contribute to one political party or candidate, and potentially with public funding of political campaigns, something that it's very difficult for us to achieve in the United States. We did have in the United States limits on the ability of individuals to contribute to particular political campaigns, and these were essentially eviscerated and rendered nearly meaningless by our Supreme Court a few years ago in a very famous decision called Citizens United. That was one of the parties to a judicial dispute in which our Supreme Court, I think your Dean is probably very familiar with this case, ruled in what I consider to be one of the most outrageous decisions made by our Supreme Court in the last century, that being able to spend money on an electoral campaign was equivalent to free speech, and therefore any corporation or any individual, if they spent it independently, could have as much speech as they wanted. This has just really deteriorated the quality of democracy in the United States. Obviously, equality also has to do with the fair representation of women and minorities in parliament and in cabinets, and in leveling economic inequalities, because those obviously heavily shape political inequality. And in the era we live in of globalization and so on, that's an increasing challenge. The next slide also emphasizes the importance of fair representation of ethnic minorities and their ability to have their own parliament on a provincial basis, and the fair treatment of citizens, as I've said, by government agencies and institutions and by the courts, regardless of their class, their region, their religion, their gender, and so on. Then next slide, the 10th dimension is a responsive government. What's this all for? Ultimately, the idea is citizen control over government, and that means the ability of citizens to make government responsive to their wishes and aspirations. Now, if society were one huge mass that had relatively unanimous views on a subject, that would be very easy. But the problem is that in a democracy, there are different interests, and they have different and often conflicting desires for public policy. And this creates interesting dilemmas in terms of who government responds to. But the problem is in many democracies, and again I'm being honest about the limitations and flaws of democracy in the United States, money can distort this process. And money in politics and the unlimited flows of money into political campaigns can compel and induce elected representatives and executive officials to be more responsive to people with money than to more populous and broadly weighty demographically, more widely represented interests in society that don't have money, don't have corporate power, just have numbers, but not necessarily the ability to organize them. Next slide simply elaborates this and suggests that over time, citizens, when they have grievances, should be able to win some redress of them, some attention by government to them, and there should be the ability of people to be heard in terms of their concerns. I'm moving quickly now. The next slide has to do with the civic culture, that a quality democracy is a democracy in which people are civil to one another. They are respectful of different points of view, tolerant of differences of all kinds, political and social, respectful of the Constitution and the law, and always, always rejecting of violence, no matter how passionately they may feel aggrieved. Willing to compromise, at least in terms of issue differences, hopefully not compromise in terms of their commitment to democratic principles, and unwilling to coalesce with undemocratic extremist actors. Next slide. And that means that the vast majority of citizens and groups believe in the legitimacy of democracy and are loyal to the constitutional system. The next slide, and the last dimension of democratic quality, has to do with the effectiveness of the state. That a quality democracy is one in which the state has legitimate authority and can use it to enforce the laws, to maintain public security, exercise a monopoly of legitimate force, and to tax income and wealth in order to generate public goods, public infrastructure, health, education, and so on, and a higher quality of life. This requires a state with administrative capacity, and as my colleague Frank Fukuyama, who's also here in Kiev now, has emphasized in much of his writing and his most recent book, a state that is bureaucratic in the best Weberian sense of the word, that is professional, neutral, honest, meritocratic, and is able to perform these functions in the best interest of the collectivity, the society. This is a slide coming next. You won't be able to see it, but eventually you'll have these slides or have access to them, that looks at some of these dimensions and shows some codings, some indices that are done by Freedom House, the World Bank, and so on, which enable us to actually measure these different components of democratic quality. Okay, now I want to briefly talk about, if you keep going, a couple more slides, what's been happening in terms of democracy in the world. Next slide. And I think you know, those of you who've seen many different works, including The Spirit of Democracy, that there was, beginning in 1974, a gradual expansion of the number of electoral democracies, and then, thanks to what happened in this part of the world with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and then of the Soviet Union, really an explosion in the number of democracies. So the percentage of states in the world that meet the test, at least of electoral democracy, essentially doubled over this period of about 30 years, from about a third of all states being democracies to nearly 2/3. And you can see in the next slide, if you look at the graph, it's a little hard to see here, but the red line shows this dramatic increase in electoral democracies from 29% in 1974 to 62% in 2005, and then some slippage backwards to about 60% today. And that's what I want to address in my conclusion. And the percentage of liberal democracies, and by liberal democracy now I have an empirical indicator of that, on the Freedom House scale of political rights and civil liberties, which vary from 1, the most liberal, to 7, the most repressive. All those countries that get a 1 or a 2 on political rights and a 1 or a 2, so one of the 2 best scores on civil liberties as well, those are the ones that I'm saying, for practical measurement purposes here, we can roughly call liberal democracies. And there's now about 45% of the states in the world that meet that test. So we don't want to be too discouraged about the state of the world or even the state of Europe. Liberal democracy has grown in the world. Next slide. And again, about 2/3 of the world's democracies now meet this test of liberal democracy, where there is, not perfect, but extensive competition, freedom, and rule of law. Next slide. So one of the striking things about the world we live in, which we could not have said even 20 years ago, is that democracy has become not only the dominant form of government in the world, but the dominant form of government in many parts of the world, including, of course, Europe, but also Latin America, and has a very substantial presence in Asia and Africa. The only region of the world that doesn't have a critical mass of democracies is the Middle East, where the only democracies are Turkey and Israel, and very, very tentatively, we'll see if they can really consolidate it, Tunisia, which is the first Arab democracy in a very long time. The next slide just shows the red bar on the left of each region is the presence of electoral democracy, and the white bar is the presence of liberal democracy. And you can see on the far right, the 2 bars on the far right, is the Middle East and North Africa and how much it trails the rest of the world. Next slide shows trends in global freedom. Again, it's a little bit hard to see from where most of you are sitting, but the average score for the world improved on the 1 to 7 scale of political rights and civil liberties, averaging the 2, from 4.47, which is slightly below the midpoint, in 1974, to 3.22 in about 2005. And it's slipped back a little bit since then. Not a lot, but you're going to see other indications of what I call a global recession of democracy. The next slide show these trends with respect to regions. And one of the points I would make here, if you just look at the line that's kind of second to the bottom, which is the brown line, that is the average score on political rights and civil liberties for the 12 states of the former Soviet Union. That is, all of the states of the former Soviet Union except the Baltic states, which I group with Central and Eastern Europe. And it's a little bit hard for most of you to see, so I'll simply say that the average score for the former Soviet Union, of course, shot up from 7 for the Soviet Union in 1986 or so, and then it gradually improved a little bit to 6.56, and then it reached 4.59 in 1991, and it looked like the former Soviet Union was on its way to becoming a dramatically freer place. And the former Soviet Union is the one region of the world that has experienced the most dramatic regression of freedom since 1991. And it's now back down to 5.17 in 2012, which essentially ties it with the Middle East and North Africa for the lowest levels of freedom. Next slide. So these are the reasons why I argue there has been a democratic recession in the world in the last 7 or 8 years. First of all, there's been some erosion in the number of democracies in the world, from a high of about 120 to about 117 now. There's been no significant gain in the number of democracies in these past 7 years. And indeed, for each of these last 7 years, as Freedom House notes, the number of countries that have been declining in their level of freedom from the previous year has significantly outstripped the number of countries gaining in freedom. And there's been a particularly significant erosion of democracy in Africa, not very surprising, since this is the poorest region of the world, and so from a sociological standpoint, you might predict democracy would be most challenged in poor countries. Next slide. There's some other reasons as well. There have been a lot of reversals of democracy since the third wave began. In fact, as you'll see in perhaps the next slide when we come to it in a minute, about a third, that's a pretty high proportion, of all the democracies that have existed during the third wave, that includes France, Britain, the United States, about a third of all the existing democracies have failed during this period. And if we look at democratic breakdowns and we divide this period into three groups, the rate of democratic breakdown since 1999 has been nearly twice the rate of the two previous eras, particularly the last 12 years. There have been some 30 breakdowns of democracy just since 1999, and as you see, these have come in some very big and strategic states like Pakistan, Russia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Thailand, and so on. The next slide shows the ratios of gains to losses in freedom during this period, and if you look at the second bar, that's 1.0, so all of the bars above that mean that more countries are gaining rather than losing, and you can see for the last 7 years the ratio has been inverted, and in most of these years twice as many countries or more have been declining in freedom as opposed to gaining. Fortunately, last year the balance almost came back to parity. You'll see this better if you look at the slides once they're put online. Next slide. So there have been 29 breakdowns of democracy with no return to democracy. And next slide, there have been 27 breakdowns of democracy with a return to democracy. This slide is not quite accurate, by the end of 2012. And fortunately now in this year, Mali, which was one of the most tragic losses of democracy in a military coup because it had been a very, very, very poor African country that looked like it was making democracy work. Fortunately, earlier this year, Mali had elections and a return to democracy. The next slide shows what I was saying before, that the rate, the first bar on the left shows the rate of democratic breakdown, 1974 to 85, 16%. Then next, 1986 to 1998, 11.7% of the democracies failed. 1999 to 2011, the third bar from the left, 20% of the democracies failed. So that's almost twice the previous 12 years. And overall for this nearly 30-year period, almost 33% of these democracies have failed. Next slide. I'm going to skip this in interest of time and go 2 slides. 1, 2, okay. So to conclude, why has democracy been under so much pressure? Why is it in danger? I have a very simple explanation here. It's not the economic recession. Though certainly I do want to stress, democracy has to perform ultimately if people are going to value it and retain it. But if you look at what has happened to democracies around the world since the global financial crisis that happened almost exactly 5 years ago in September of 2008, that broke across national borders, you see that the most common reaction to economic distress in democracies was for countries to replace their governments in elections, free and fair elections, but not to overthrow democracy. And where democracy failed, it wasn't primarily because of economic distress, because of a plunge in the economic growth rate. It was because of bad governance, because of corruption, abuse of power, abuse of individual rights, rulers who are trying to override the Constitution to barricade themselves in power, executive abuse of power, and decimation of civil society. Next slide. As well as ethnic and religious divisions and weak and ineffective political institutions. Poor economic performance played a role. Resentment over poverty, inequality, and injustice played a role, but it was part of a larger picture of bad governance. And this then results in two trajectories. Number one, in many countries, and of course Russia has been the poster child for this, the demise of democracy is death by 1,000 cuts at the hand of the president himself. In Russia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in a lot of other countries we could point to, where ambitious autocrats get elected and then gradually strangle democratic processes and reduce all independent institutions to their political control while they use state power to victimize their political opponents. And then the other trajectory is one of public disillusionment, where people say, the one thing we expect from democracy, this may sound tautological, but if you'll hear me out, it isn't. The one thing we expect from democracy is democracy. That is, we know we are actually democratic citizens, maybe a little more sophisticated than academics and politicians give us credit for. We know that economic growth can be fleeting and that, a new president can't produce economic miracles overnight. But the one thing that a democratically elected president, prime minister, ruling party can do is observe the Constitution and the rule of law and protect our freedom and operate under the law with respect for the law. And if they can't even do that, what are they good for? And so when there is systematic disrespect for and decimation of the rules of the democratic game, democracy is either strangled by the presidents and ruling parties who commit those atrocities against democracy, or people become disillusioned with a political system in which the political players themselves do not have respect for the rules of the game. So therefore, it becomes incumbent in those circumstances on people like you and civil society to stand up and defend democracy. That's my presentation. Thank you very much, and now I'll answer your questions.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. It was an inspiration. If anybody would like to ask questions, please approach the microphone, and I would like to abuse my power and ask the first question. How does Ukraine fit?
I think, at a minimum, Ukraine is an instance of decline in the quality of democracy. From a democracy that had the potential, after the Orange Revolution, to become consolidated and more liberal and better functioning, to use a word that I used in the title of a different book for a different purpose, a squandered opportunity. I think what happened during, I'm sorry to say it because he's someone I think that we have an obligation to honor the role he played in the Orange Revolution, but obviously citizens rendered a judgment about the performance of democracy and of governance under the 5 years of President Yushchenko. And the divisions that seeped into and fractured the coalition that was born in the Orange Revolution, I think were very sad and very consequential. And it shouldn't be shocking, given what happened leading up to the Orange Revolution, and kind of given his roots, that the quality of democracy has deteriorated, and that respect for freedom of the press and freedom of civil society has been under pressure under the presidency of President Yanukovych. I personally think that it is imperative, independent of the European Union, that Yulia Tymoshenko be released from prison. But that's not enough. I hope the European Union will be more demanding than that in terms of requiring that the current government respect basic principles of democracy like freedom of the press. Yes.
Good afternoon, my name is Katerina Odapchenko, and I know that you have some researches about party systems and how important is democracy party building, you know? Parties which based on fundraising, on horizontal accountability in party system, in the democracy development in Ukraine. Because in Ukraine we have mostly leaders type of party, but not ideology.
What you are describing is a problem that is very, very common. It's hardly unique to Ukraine. And it's very common that in new democracies, and even not so new democracies, it's become a particular problem in the television age, where the focus is more on personalities than on the parties and the programs. And this has become strikingly the case even in a lot of parliamentary systems. It used to be that presidential systems were more personality-based in terms of electoral choices in a general election, and parliamentary systems were more program-based, ideologically based. But in the era of television and just media intensity, the drift has been toward personalities. This was very apparent in the recent Australian parliamentary election. It's been becoming more so in Europe, in Israel, and so on. Nevertheless, there is a lot of variation between the established democracies, where parties are more institutionalized, there are rules, there are deep structures, there is some gesture toward the development of, and often more than a gesture, fully articulated programs, if not ideologies, and the shallow, fleeting nature of personality-dominated parties in some of the new democracies, not only in the post-communist world, but in Asia, Africa, and so on. And your question would probably be then, so what do we do about it? And I think this is a challenge for younger members of these political parties to, and it's a dilemma for them as well. On the one hand, to try to push for greater internal democracy in these political parties, so decisions are not made and candidates are not nominated just from the top down, but the constituent members of the parties have more of a role, and there's more institutionalization of decision-making, consultation, and so on. Our two-party institutes in the United States that work abroad, the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, have done a lot of work to try and diffuse some tools and models of intra-party democracy and of institutionalization of different functions of party building, like development of programs, public opinion polling, things like this, development of regional bureaus of the party so that they can sync geographic roots. I think this is a challenge of party building and party institutionalization so that political parties don't rest on individual personalities. To some extent, this problem gets a little better with time and transcending the founding personalities of a democracy, but it's something that just needs work, innovation, mobilization, a little bit of risk-taking on the part of younger members of political parties who may need to put their immediate interests at risk in order to take a stand in this regard.
Good afternoon, Mr. Diamond. My name is I am a student of political science. That's why today's lecture was very interesting for me. Thank you for it. And my question isn't actually about democracy, but what is your opinion towards situation in Syria? Nowadays it's a very popular problem. And how do you think, is it possible to avoid military conflict? Thank you.
Well, it's not possible to avoid military conflict because you have a civil war in which 100,000 people have died. I don't know what you can call that except a military conflict. So then, I don't mean to trivialize your question, which I think means, is it possible to avoid international military conflict? Which is another way of saying, is it possible to avoid the United States bombing some parts of Syria in retaliation for the Assad regime's, I think, fairly obvious use of chemical weapons against its own people. You know, I'm not sure it's a good idea for me to inflict my personal views about this rather political question on this audience now. But, I mean, there is a respect in which it's not irrelevant to the subject of the day, because human rights are part of democracy. And I think it's an extremely complicated issue with a lot of dimensions that involve process and therefore international law, as well as humanitarian concerns. I'll simply say that I believe very, very strongly in the responsibility to protect. And I think we have abandoned, as an international community, the obligation to honor the responsibility to protect by standing aside and watching tens of thousands of innocent civilians in Syria slaughtered by the regime, and now atrocities, I think, being committed by some of the more extremist elements of the resistance as well, particularly the radical Islamists. I just don't think any of us should want to live in a world in which a dictatorship can, in one of the rare instances since World War I, probably for only the third time, use chemical weapons against its own people or against anybody and then not have the world do anything. Frankly, I think Syria needs to be punished, and I think that it is really tragic and deeply worrisome to me that international opinion has crystallized so rapidly around a stance of, it's not our problem, we don't want to be involved, please, after Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., no more military interventions. We could talk maybe afterwards about the specifics of this, but I'll just say no one is talking about putting any troops on the ground there, number one. And number two, I certainly think it'd be deeply unfortunate if the United States wound up acting alone. But I believe very, very strongly that if this odious regime winds up having been able to use a weapon of mass destruction against its own people without any international response, any tangible consequences, that we will have entered a different world. And we will have entered a different world in an era when more and more states, authoritarian states, are trying to get weapons of mass destruction, when North Korea has a large number of nuclear weapons, when Iran is very close to getting a nuclear weapon, When other states may decide chemical weapons are easier and cheaper, maybe we'll get those. That's not a world we should want to live in.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Olesnevich Dmitro, and I have a question about government and society. Every political system has a disadvantage because it is controlled by selfish people. Each of us is selfish. So which ways are to become our society more less selfish, and how our governments can think more about society and less about themselves? Thank you.
So I really appreciate your question, because I think maybe coming more to philosophy now, or political philosophy than empirical political science, a good theory of government has to begin with a realistic theory of human nature. And until we have some kind of radical genetic engineering that I would not favor because of I don't trust the people who would probably be doing it, we're going to live with the genetic limitations that you have described. That people have an instinct towards selfishness. It can be tempered, and I think in many societies, most successfully the Scandinavian societies, it has been by the development of a culture of public commitment, good governance, social equality, and so on. But still, in the end, we're all human beings with the tendency toward overriding and even egregious self-interestedness. So what you've said then underscores everything I've said. It was a fundamental insight behind the crafting of the American Constitution. And it jumps out repeatedly from the pages of Madison's work in the Federalist Papers, that human beings are flawed. They have a tendency toward greed and the pursuit of self-interest, and therefore you need powerful constraints on their behavior and very elaborate checks and balances in order to constrain their worst instincts and incentivize them to do the right thing, which is to govern in the public interest rather than in the self-interest. I should remember the exact wording, and I apologize to you that I don't, but one of the most famous phrases of one of our founding fathers and then President of the United States, James Madison, is something like this. If men were angels, and of course he meant people, not men, I hope, we would have no need for laws or government at all. And it's the fact that they're not angels. They have a tendency toward greed and self-interest that propels us in this direction. And it's precisely why we need very far-reaching, I would even say radical, provisions for horizontal accountability. I am just simply a militant on this. If you don't have strong, autonomous, neutral, independent, well-resourced, well-staffed, professional institutions of monitoring and control, counter-corruption agency, ombudsman, Supreme Audit Agency, and audit agencies within the different ministries, legislative committees of oversight, and all independent courts and prosecutors, the whole architecture that I've articulated, well, men and women will not be angels. They'll get away with what they can get away with. And if they know that there is a significant prospect of being exposed for self-seeking behavior, disgraced, punished, and ruined as a result, they'll not do it. And I think that there's a lot of language about we need cultural change, you know. Until we get a change in self-interested behavior and norms, you know, nothing will work. I really think that's the wrong approach. Of course, these need to move to some extent in tandem. But I've seen a lot of evidence to suggest that people in part draw and intuit what are the right norms from what the society collectively does to enforce them and to send signals about what's right and what's wrong. So punish bad behavior, invest in institutions to generate serious consequences for it, and then I think you'll move the culture in a better direction as well. Okay, thank you.
Good evening, you of Samat Law School. I would like to clarify, do you argue that in Ukraine, where we do not have traditions and mentality exposed, favorable for democracy, if we do achieve good results in building institutions and procedures by means of legislation, will it work? And the second question is, we in Ukraine become more and more cynical and desperate and disappointed in the ability of our fellow citizens to maintain democracy. And we even speak of restricting general voting rights, taking in consideration education, welfare, given rates of IQ. It is definitely and obviously unacceptable, but would it be better if we had, in respect of at least presidential elections, the system more similar to American, when people do not choose the president directly, but through some kind of layer of their representatives? Okay, so let me try and move through those questions quickly. First of all, of course, I'm totally opposed to any restrictions on the franchise or on participation, and I'll come back to that when I talk about civic education. Secondly, no, don't have an electoral college. We're trying to get rid of it in the United States. It's a bad idea. I think if you're worried about direct election of a president, and there's a case to be made in that score, then get rid of the presidential system and have a parliamentary system. That's a better way of addressing the problem. In response to your first question, I want to stress that I am by no means saying that because a country has not had a democracy before, you know, it can't have a democracy or a liberal democracy. But I think a better way for civil society to frame the moment that Ukraine is in now is not to be overly cynical, and not to say the politicians are all corrupt and you know, we stand above them morally, and the whole system is rotten, and not to become too despairing about how much democracy has slipped backwards in Ukraine, though I think unambiguously it has. But rather to say it's a long process, it's a long road, it's a long, and as I said, not perfectly linear struggle to build and institutionalize democracy, and that it's something that needs to be thought of in generational terms. So we, you, especially you, it is the burden, the responsibility, and the opportunity of our generation, not in a few years, over a very long period of time, to build an institutionalized democracy, a quality democracy, a liberal democracy, a free society, a rule of law society. And it's going to be uneven. There may be reversals, but this has to be the overriding responsibility and commitment of our generation. And in that regard,
I do think it's not only about institution building and lawmaking, it's also, you have to go to work on the normative side of this, and there's an enormous responsibility and role for civic education, for raising public consciousness, for deepening democratic values, for developing programs of practice and not just education to do this. There's been a lot of innovation and work to develop the ideas and skills of democratic civic education that I think countries are borrowing from across borders.
Hello, my name is Evgeny Semelnikov, I'm a private entrepreneur. I would not be in the same mind with the previous person, because I think that Ukrainian nation has a deep history of democracy that was not put on paper, as you mentioned in your presentation, but it was in human minds, especially before Soviet regime, so say 19th, 18th century. So this is my first question. What is your opinion on this issue? And second is, what do you think about a new world order? There is a lot of talks in English-speaking society that after upcoming war, there is going to be a new government, strong government that is going to rule all over the planet. Thank you.
So, in response to your first question, of course, well, not necessarily of course, but it is the case that I don't have enough knowledge about Ukrainian history to mediate the debate between you and the previous questioner. But I do think it's the case that many countries, and I think this is true of Ukraine, have elements and aspects of democratic institutions, practice, ideas, struggle in their past that can be resources that they build upon to make a better and deeper democracy in their current moment. In terms of the New World Order, my God, it's such a huge subject, I don't know where to begin. I will just say, obviously, we're in a more multipolar world than we were in before.
Yet.
And the United States is no longer as dominant as it was during the Cold War and as it was in the immediate aftermath of the demise of the Soviet Union. And so we need to be more active and creative in trying to build a community of democracies. Indeed, there is such a thing as a community of democracies. I encourage you to look it up, and I hope it will become a more effective gathering of the democracies of the world. But unfortunately, a lot of the G20 emerging democracies, while they've made progress in developing democracy within their own borders in many cases, have been very, very reluctant to promote democratic principles and values and defend them outside their borders. And this is, I think, one of the core aspects of the dilemma we're in now, not only with respect to Syria, but in many parts of the world.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Yuri Shiko. First of all, Professor Diamond, I want to thank you for your interesting lecture, and I have two questions.
Okay.
First question is more theoretical one. You were talking about liberal democracy as a single concept, but as it was shown by Chantamu, for example, that liberal democracy is not a single concept, but two concepts, just a combination of two concepts and not logically necessary combination. Yeah, and or for example, you were talking about different aspects of liberal democracy as Republican and liberal, and as it was shown by Jürgen Habermas that two models of democracy, liberal and Republican, have their differences and even contradictions. This is so. Do you see liberal democracy as the concept or just a list of different characteristics? And the second one, practical question, is also connected with this. You were talking about imposing restrictions to state agencies and at the same time of state agencies being efficient. And the example of security and intelligence agencies, how to impose restrictions or civil control over those intelligence agencies, as first their activity is mostly classified, And the second one, they should be really strong to counteract, for example, to Chinese intelligence, or in case, for example, as Brazil, Mexico, or Germany, to counteract to NSA of the United States. It was shown lately. So, thank you very much.
Okay. So I'm going to be very brief now in answering the remaining questions because I've got to take not only you but 4 more people in about 5 minutes because we need to close very soon. So let me just be brief in saying, clearly, Habermas is right. There are multiple concepts, maybe not only 2, but even more elements, and they're in tension with one another. So clearly the liberal element is in tension with the Republican element. And the element of popular sovereignty is in tension both with the liberal element and the good government element. People may not want, as a pure majority, to be very tolerant of minorities, for example. And so it's an uneasy balance, and one that may constantly need to be renegotiated over time. On the intelligence agencies, I think we have begun to see in the United States ways in which Congress or a parliament can be exposed to, become knowledgeable about extremely sensitive information, classified information, and have it still be kept classified or secret while exercising scrutiny and control. For example, members, you have a select committee on intelligence, and they can not only hold public hearings, but also closed hearings that only the members and maybe their staffs and the agency officials attend. And there may be some documents that only the actual members of parliament, not even their staffs, would see. You know, it's very interesting, and for now I'm going to need to just close with this point. The leaks of classified information, it appears, have never come from our parliament, our Congress. They've always come from the executive branch or operational officials. So there is a way to make this work.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to need to ask you 4 remaining to be very brief. Only ask one question, and then I'm going to be brief in my answer.
Thank you. My name is Shakil, and my question is of the sphere of political philosophy. What do you think about of future of democracy as a political system, and what do you think about the concept of post-democracy?
So I think that we are not done, okay, that clearly needs to be stated. We are not done with the institutional and philosophical evolution of democracy as a political system. And I think particularly in the era of the internet and the opportunities it provides for the dissemination of knowledge and for horizontal communication among citizens and for empowerment of citizens, we can imagine and are even seeing exciting possibilities for the deepening and elaboration of the processes and principles of democracy. But I don't think there is something other than democracy that's waiting at the end of some process of evolution in the sense of some better form of political system than democracy. I think the essentials of, the bare essentials of liberal democracy in terms of freedom, accountability, but also the ability of the people to change and replace their leaders through voting and free and fair elections. I don't think there is a post-democracy that transcends those things. I just think that there is going to be evolution toward better, more flexible, and innovative means of achieving the basic principles of democracy and also trying to reconcile some of these tensions I was talking about.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, my name is Hanna Polishchuk. I would like, in your presentation, you mentioned fourth branch of government, and in my opinion, this branch has to be relatively responsible and disinterested in taking part in government and all this corruption that is going on here. And how do you think where should those people be taken from? I mean, should be pure Ukrainians, or they can be representatives from NGOs, and how should they be elected?
The members of these agencies of horizontal accountability?
Independent agency.
Yeah. Well, you've asked an extremely interesting question, and it's one I've really kind of thought about and wrestled with, and that I think societies really need to do innovative constitutional thinking about. The problem is that in contrast to political parties, non-governmental organizations generally have no legal or constitutional standing in the political system. And so it's hard to constitutionally or legally mandate their inclusion or representation in these bodies. But I think that difficulty needs to be transcended. And so creative means need to be imagined for how, yes, members of some of these agencies can be drawn from civil society. Can the laws, for example, recognize the role of the Bar Association or of other established, the Journalists Association or other established organizations in civil society to be consulted, to nominate some members of these bodies? You have to have a very fine-grained knowledge of a society to know how to do that. I only know that that is a good idea or a good goal to pursue, and then people really need to think creatively, and it doesn't have to be done constitutionally. The encouraging thing about this is once you get perhaps to a better moment in Ukrainian democracy, Parliament can pass legislation that would enrich the mechanisms by which, and also protect and insulate the mechanisms by which these independent bodies would be elected. My underlying argument is don't politicize them. Rather than stuff multiple political parties into the Electoral Commission, I think it's much better to mandate that the members of the Electoral Commission or even the Counter-Corruption Commission have no connection to political parties at all. And then you have to think about, therefore, where can they be drawn from? Having a really professional and meritocratic bureaucracy and judiciary that's really insulated from partisan politics is an important piece of this puzzle, but it doesn't solve the particular angle of the problem that you've raised.
Thank you very much.
Okay, 2 more questions and then we're done. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Darina Karagina, and seeing that you're a world-renowned expert in democracies, it's only logical to ask you, do you think that democracy should and can be implemented in every state? Because in Middle East it completely failed, and the attempts to establish it, as in Syria, for example, have been drowned in blood. So taking the political culture, for example, in the Middle East or Africa, should it be, maybe it's better for them to just be that way they were before.
Okay, so it's important that we start with a good analysis of what's happened in the Arab world. The attempt to establish democracy never got off the ground in Syria. It was resisted by a brutal dictatorship that decided to respond to street protests with vicious repression, which then induced people, I wish there had been another way to do it because I'm a strong believer in nonviolence, but then induced people to take up arms in violent resistance. The protests in Syria did not begin with violent resistance. They began with nonviolent resistance that was brutally suppressed and drove people to arms. Similarly, in Bahrain, you can say, well, look what happened. There's been violence, the whole thing imploded. The thing imploded because a minority monarchy from a minority religious sect in the country decided to completely resist popular demands for democracy and was able to call upon a military that's heavily populated with imported soldiers, and then call on troops from Saudi Arabia to brutally suppress nonviolent campaigns for democratic change. I mean, when people rise up and peacefully protest for democracy, and then a brutal dictatorship suppresses it, I don't think it's a good analytic perspective to say democracy has failed. It is correct to say that autocracy has triumphed, but democracy was never tried. Now, it's a little bit different in Egypt. I think your argument has more weight there. There were elections. They were poorly organized. I could go on at length about how I think the transition got fouled up in Egypt. But I do want to stress again what I said before with respect to Ukraine. Democratization is typically and often a long, long journey. The journey is not over in Egypt, and it's not over in the rest of the Arab world, including the countries that have not had yet their Arab Spring, their moment of protest. It's coming at some point in Jordan, in Morocco, sometime down the road, even, I believe, in Saudi Arabia and in some of the other Gulf states. In Egypt, I don't think the country can just return to a Mubarak-style military rule with the civilian guise. It's going to... The pressure for better and more accountable governance will return again. And finally, I'd just say, watch Tunisia. Tunisia is the one Arab country that still, has the minimal conditions of electoral democracy, very, very tentatively, that is still struggling through a peaceful and collective negotiating process for democratic change, and may get there. And if you get one electoral democracy that really takes root in the Arab world, it will be a transformative development, because that will be one more than the Arab world has had for the last 40 years. And if it shows it can work, and it can work in Tunisia, then that will be an inspiration and a point of diffusion for the rest of the Arab world.
Thank you.
Okay, last question. Thank you for your patience.
Good evening. I want to ask a question concerning oil states. You have once mentioned in your lectures on Coursera, which I had a great pleasure to study, that there is something about democracy and oil states. And so is oil really an important factor in the global recession of democracy? And if it is, why is it so difficult for an oil state and a democracy to coexist normally? Thank you.
The answer to your question involves a lot of different dimensions of what are called the resource curse, in terms of the distortions economically that are introduced when countries become dependent for their national income on natural resource wealth, on commodities like oil, but it could be other things that fluctuate very rapidly in price in world markets and in demand. But the distortion in terms of the governance relationship is more relevant to this lecture and far more serious. And here the problem is not just oil, it's any source of external rents. Personally, I believe that foreign aid can be, and frequently is, a functional substitute. When the government gets its revenue from some external rent, whatever it is, rather than from internal taxation, the organic relationship of accountability and responsibility between government and citizens is preempted or severed. And citizens are no longer, thinking of themselves as people who are giving their resources to the state and demanding responsiveness and good governance in return. They're simply clients seeking some of the rents that are falling down from the sky into the government and its political leaders, and so they just want to get a piece of this bounty. And it may seem a bit odd to say this, but I think it's an increasingly well-established principle that just as was the case in the founding of the American Republic, where we argued that there can't be taxation without representation. That was the cry of the American Revolution. There can't be representation. There can't be effective democratic governance and citizenship without taxation. Without people knowing they are giving some of their resources to the government and they have the right to demand something in return. They are citizens. They are the principals, and the people in government are their agents. And this is why in the latest issue of the magazine Foreign Affairs, I have a rather controversial piece called Petroleum to the People. It's a play on a different revolutionary cry of a different era. And it makes a simple argument that these oil states should give the money back to the people directly and then tax back whatever they're going to claim as government revenue. And then that will generate the principle that the resources belong to the people, and whatever the government has is the people's money and not the government's money, and the people have a right to accountable performance in return. Thank you all for waiting till the end.